In 1968, the behavioral researcher John B. Calhoun performed an experiment. He wanted to create an utopia for mice and called it Universe 25. He provided the mice with everything they needed and wanted to see what happens if they live under such conditions. Unlimited resources like water and food. They didn't have predators, no external threats or diseases. The climate was temperature controlled. And yeah, basically they had everything they needed. And how do we call such a condition where you have more than you need of everything? Right, we call it utopia or paradise. The experiment went well for quite some time and reached at its peak a population of about 2,200 mice. But then suddenly something surprising happened. Something that Calhoun didn't anticipate. The social fabric began to tear. The males stopped defending their territory, the females abandoned their children, and violence came up. Not a systematic kind of violence, just pure chaos. And also something interesting happened. A specific side group emerged, and Calhoun called them the beautiful ones. Why the beautiful ones? Because they were perfectly groomed, they didn't really interact with the others anymore, they felt, in a way, superior, or at least that was how it looked like, and they lost interest in almost everything they had. And after that, the population collapsed, and finally, all the mice died. Does that sound familiar to you? Unlimited resources, everybody's taken care of, nobody really needs to work, a life in comfort. Right, that's almost our life in 2026. And I think you already know which mouse you are. So why did I make this video? Not because it's a fascinating piece of behavioral science. That also. But more than that, it's because I recognized myself in this experiment. I think that I was a beautiful one for many years. Well, maybe I still am today, who knows. But even more so in my corporate life. And I didn't understand it until I heard about Universe 25. That's the story I want to share with you today. And also what I did with it. In my other videos, I talked already extensively about what technology, and specifically AI, does to our human essence and to our well-being, and how we can deal with it better. If you didn't see them yet, you should definitely subscribe and check them out. But today I want to focus on a phenomenon that occurred even before all this technology came up. The question we want to answer today is, what happens when comfort itself becomes the pathology? Because this is how many of us grew up. I was born in '78, grew up in the '80s, '90s, and started my professional life in the 2000s. For many of us in the West, we never faced real challenges. We were always taken care of. There were no wars we had to fight, there were no bigger economical crises. We lived in excellent times to grow up. And that's where it all leads to. We live today in Universe 25. We live in a controlled experiment. Some call it a simulation. We removed all challenge from our life, and now let's see what happens with that. So why do I say that I was a beautiful one? Well, basically during my corporate life, I had everything in order. I had a good job, I had a good salary, I had a house and a nice family. My LinkedIn profile was polished. So from the outside, it looked like a very successful life. But something internally was missing. I wasn't really fulfilled. And it was not that I suffered in any way, but that's exactly the point. The beautiful ones don't suffer. They just stop living. And that is what I call the curse of a good life. Because we have a good life. But because it's such a good life, it's even more difficult to change from there. Even more than if you come out from a crisis or a drama or disease. That might sound now a little bit strange that I'm saying that, but from such a situation, from a more difficult situation, it's easier to change. So because I felt something was missing, I was always interested in personal development and how to improve myself further. So I tried a lot of methods and read a lot of books, but I found that most of them kind of stayed on the surface. Their goal was mainly to continue optimizing this external image that we're holding up and not really working on the internal real problem. Until about 8 years ago, when I started dream journaling. And in the beginning, I didn't think a lot about it. I did it mainly out of curiosity. And I also didn't know exactly what to do with my dreams. But there was, especially in the beginning, an image in my dreams that came repeatedly to me. And that was me in a room that I couldn't escape from. And that was not something scary, not a nightmare in a classical sense. It was just a room without windows and without doors. So I was somehow cut completely from the external world. And I woke up from the dreams and I didn't think a lot and I continued my life. Till one day I realized that this dream is representing my reality. That was how I lived my life. I was living in this golden cage I couldn't escape from. That is a typical sign for the shadow that is coming up and trying to get heard. And this is what shadow work in midlife looks at the beginning. It's not coming as a crisis. It's coming as a gap. The gap between the image you represent to the world, between the persona you build up in your professional life and the person who you really are. And with the years, this gap is growing bigger until it can't be unheard anymore. And if you're still watching this video, I suspect you know that gap already. So let's dive a little bit deeper in Jung's concept about the persona and the self. Carl Jung wrote in his book Modern Man in Search of His Soul that the second half of life is very different or has a very different task than the first half. In the first half, you're building exactly this persona, this mask. And this is also needed, it's necessary, it's not something bad. All of us are doing that because we need this mask, this representation to function in the external world. We need it for the interaction with our societies, for creating a successful career, and also to find our place in community. We could consider this more like an external growth. But in the second half, suddenly the direction of the growth changes. It moves more inward. That doesn't mean we get rid of the persona completely. We still have that, and it still works to function in the outer world. But we're not asking anymore, we're not trying anymore to get more successful. We're trying to understand the real question, who we really are, what do we really want. And this is the process Carl Jung calls individuation. Now, coming back to the beautiful ones, for them, the persona has become everything. And there's a big overlap to our professional world today, because most professionals have a very impressive persona. That's not necessarily bad, because it helps you to have a successful career, but it can be also dangerous, because the persona can be mistaken with the self. The shadow is avoided, it's pushed away completely. So what Calhoun figured out with the mice is what Jung defined for humans. It's the condition that real challenge, real growth was removed. And that means our psyche loses its building material. But individuation requires resistance. It's like training a muscle, right? If you don't train your muscle, it will shrink and it will die. Our beautiful ones, they stopped growing. But the next thing is, it doesn't stop there. There's a psychological effect that Jung calls Enantiodromia. It means that if you push a condition into its extremes, it eventually flips into its opposite. And that happened to the mice. The comfort turned into meaninglessness. And that's difficult to recognize in the beginning because it doesn't look like a collapse. Actually, the collapse looks more like rest. And this is something that we at the Small Reset address. Shadow work in midlife is not about healing your inner child in some pop psychology sense. It is the psychological necessity to keep engaging with the parts you put aside. Growth is not optional. Every living organism strives for growth. Or it refuses it when it's dying. Now, before we move on, I have a short task for you. Think about when was the last time that you did something that was really frightening for you. And I'm not talking about things like watching a horror movie or going to the roller coaster. Something that really challenged you, where failure was possible, where there was real risk involved, where you were actually thinking, can I do that? And if you don't find something immediately, you should stay with me in this video. Friedrich Nietzsche saw it coming already 60 or 80 years early. That we, as a human species, will reach a condition, a state, like in Universe 25. And he described it in his book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, and he called it the last man. The last man is the most contemptible type of human being. He strives for comfort. He's proud that he eliminated suffering. He's the one who is dancing and shouting, "We invented happiness!" But the happiness is not real. Because the last man gave up something that Nietzsche calls the will to power. And this concept of Nietzsche is often misunderstood. Because it's not about aggression or about dominating others. Nietzsche means the internal drive to create new values, to build something new, to overcome yourself, to get rid of the old parts of you that don't serve you anymore. And the will to power requires suffering. The mice in Universe 25, they became the last man. And the question Nietzsche asks is, what are you still trying to overcome? What comes to your mind? Do you find something for yourself? You know, I'm talking to a lot of people, and this topic has a sense of urgency and importance right now. Because with AI, we invented the most efficient cognitive resource provider in human history. Before that, the comfort we described was mainly physical. But now AI provides also mental comfort. We are not required to think anymore. And up to now, we don't have a philosophical framework for what unlimited intellectual comfort does to our psyche and to our well-being. We won't find the answer in AI or in technology. The answer is where Nietzsche was pointing at. It's in self-overcoming. We have to keep the suffering, the struggle alive. And because it's not provided to us anymore, we have to choose it deliberately. Now let's move from philosophy to something more tangible. When I'm mentoring, I see this pattern a lot. Most of my clients, they have everything on paper. They have this good life. And when we're trying to figure out the problem, I usually ask them a question. I ask them, what do you want? Then they start talking about their career or a new relationship or where they want to be in the next 2 years. And then I ask again, ask them, what do you really want? And that second question, it's actually the same question, but then they start to understand. And that's where the uncomfortable thinking starts. And it's not because they didn't understand the question, it's just because it was unexpected. Because they didn't ask this question for many years or even decades. I also spent many years in corporate environments. And I recognize the development that I would assume many people see or sense, but they don't say it, they don't want to talk about it. And this is that many teams, so I'm talking about complete teams, about a collective behavior, not an individual behavior, they have withdrawn. They're just giving up mentally. If you're sitting in such meetings, it's mainly about PowerPoint engineering or optimizing for some KPIs that don't really matter. But if you look in the eyes of the people, there's no passion anymore. They don't really care about the outcome anymore. And that's what Calhoun calls the behavioral sink. And the behavioral sink is not a management failure. It also doesn't come from a toxic work environment. It's a beautiful one's failure. It comes from too much comfort. Now we talked already a lot about the problem and how we can eventually solve that, but let's become more concrete. How can we implement meaningful struggle into our lives? And I want to be careful here because I don't want this to be seen as an endorsement for unnecessary hardship, because that's not what it is. For example, I actively seek discomfort and struggle. I'm doing ultra-endurance events and multi-day fasting and so on. And I'm not doing that because they give me confidence. I have already a lot of confidence. But they give me the experience. The meaning is in the experience itself. Because meaning needs friction. It's not about pain for its own sake. It's this experience that our conscious and our unconscious mind needs to work with. I have another question for you. Look at your daily life. And I mean the actual texture of your days, not the version you describe to someone you want to impress. Where is the struggle? Can you find it? And with struggle, I don't mean having a busy schedule or preparing for the next board meeting. I mean something where the outcome really matters to you, where the failure is actually possible. And if you can't find that, that is your diagnosis. That's where to start. And a great way to start is with the exercise I will show you now. It's about shadow work, and shadow work in midlife is actually, it's not therapy, even it can be used as one, but it's also the practice of making the unconscious conscious. And Jung calls that the only way to rule your life. The other option is that it is ruled by your unconscious and you continue to call it fate. Now, our beautiful ones, they didn't have a mechanism for that. They became empty because they stopped reaching for anything that required them to find what they were really capable of. And that's why the question is not, what is in your shadow? What are you hiding? The real question is, where have you stopped reaching? Where have you stopped longing for? So if you want to take this serious, here is a simple task. For 1 week, keep a simple log. It's just one sentence every morning. What am I avoiding that I actually care about? It can be like a conversation or a relationship problem that you're not addressing, or a project you're delaying for a long time. And just write one sentence. And what you will find in the answer, that's the gap between your persona and shadow. At least it's one part of the gap. But keep in mind, the gap is not the problem to solve. The gap is actually where the individuation starts. Calhoun didn't warn about comfort or luxury. Universe 25 is a document of what happens when a living creature is removed from every condition that requires real engagement with its own nature. And the solution to that is not more optimization, but individuation. And from the outside, the individuation process doesn't look like achievement. Because it's not about performing, it's about starting to live. So if you recognize yourself as a beautiful one, the question is now, what are you doing with that recognition? We all live in a comfortable world, and it's easy to blame others for not starting the work. But it's your responsibility to get out of the comfort, to keep the struggle alive, to keep the living alive. The answer to that lives in shadow work and self-overcoming. That's your antidote. So the first step is to understand and name what is running your show right now. Because individuation starts with understanding the psychological pattern. And understanding doesn't mean to get rid of the pattern, because the pattern is two things, right? It's on the one hand your greatest strength, because it helps you to survive in the external world. But on the other hand, it's also the things that holding you back, that you put in your shadow. So the goal is not to go for one or the other, but to integrate both of them. And if you want to understand what's in your shadow, I developed an archetype test that helps you exactly answering this question. It won't tell you what to do or who to become, but to understand the pattern you're in. Because you can't integrate what you haven't named. And that is where your work begins. See you in the next video.